Okay.
Thank you very much to everyone for turning up. I'm Brendan Donnelly. I'm the director of the Federal Trust. As many of you will know, we have a series of conferences. We've had a series of conferences over a number of years now, jointly with the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation and the Global Policy Institute, particularly on issues of shared interest between Germany and the United Kingdom. What we're going to talk about today is fake news. We originally planned this seminar at the beginning of the year before the COVID-19 pandemic gave a new aspect to the topic. So it's become even more actual and even more pressing a topic than it was before. I'll introduce the speakers, if I may, as we go along. But can I just say that if you want to put a question or comment to the speakers, then you must do it through the question and answer button. At the moment, I intend to moderate and gather together those questions and put them to the panelists after they've been speaking. But I may vary that as the afternoon goes on. So we're going to begin, if we may, with Damian Collins, to whom, once again, many thanks for joining us. He's been the Conservative MP for Folkestone and Hythe since 2010. He was the chairman of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, and oversaw their inquiry last year on disinformation and fake news. Now he's been very active as co-founder of a website called Infotagion, combating disinformation on COVID-19. Any of those topics, either of those topics that you'd like to talk to us about, I'm sure will be of enormous interest to the audience, or you may want to range more widely. It's up to you, quarter of an hour, something like that, and then we'll go on to Julie.
Okay, great.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think it's the first time I've spoken at an event organised by the Federal Trust, but I've been involved in many events in the past with the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation, so it's particularly nice to join you this afternoon. I just wanted to start off on sort of terminology, because I think it's very important when we start this debate. The question about fake news, in some ways, has been the term fake news has been slightly confused, principally by people like Donald Trump, but it's become fake news is a kind of term that's bandied around now for just things I don't like, news I don't agree with, and therefore it's fake news. It's even used by politicians to call the mainstream media fake if they publish a story or a review that people don't like. When we're talking about fake news, you can't try and regulate political speech. Two politicians may have radically different ways of interpreting the same events or even the same set of statistics. And that's political debate and political discourse. And that's not fake news, that's opinion, and people make their arguments and people make their decisions. What we're really talking about with fake news is a combination of either disinformation or misinformation. Misinformation, I would say, is the less serious of the two. It's something that's wrong. It's someone may be relaying a fact or a piece of information which is inaccurate or incorrect. They may not necessarily be aware of that fact, but nevertheless, they've done it. Disinformation is the more sinister part here, because that is the malicious, deliberate spreading of lies, of falsehoods, in order to cause an effect. And that's the thing that we should be more concerned about, whether that is spreading conspiracy theories that could lead to physical harm during a public health crisis, or people seeking to undermine our democracy. The spreading of disinformation is being done in an orchestrated way through networks that work through social media. Some of those have been traced back to agencies in Russia or China. Some may just be very highly organized networks of private individuals that are hard to trace. But nevertheless, these networks exist. And what we've seen over the last few years is not only our awareness of these networks growing, but we've seen that they move from topic to topic. So they're not just set up or organically as a kind of movement that sprung up, has very strong views about a topic. These are networks that have existed for periods of time, are added to constantly, and move from topic to topic. So they may have been talking about coronavirus or Black Lives Matter demonstrations. They will pick on any topic that they think is of public interest and that is controversial, or where it's possible to cause and create division. And we also should remember as well, for people familiar with Russian disinformation, this is straight out of that playbook, is that the object of someone spreading disinformation is not necessarily to persuade you of an alternative set of facts. It's to leave you in a state where you don't know what to believe. That there's so many different narratives or counter narratives out there, stories that are likely to be false, but hard to prove one way or another, that you come away thinking, I don't know what to believe. I don't believe the mainstream media. I don't believe the government. I don't believe the public health authorities. I don't know what to believe. Now, this problem has been around for a long time. I mean, disinformation is not a new thing. I think it's become much more potent in the age of social media, where more people are increasingly reliant on social media to get their news. In the UK, about half of people will get some of their news every month from social media. If you go to countries like Mexico, it's more like 70 to 80%. If you go to a country like the Philippines, almost 100% of people in the Philippines access the internet through Facebook. Well, Facebook basically is the internet for them, and that is the case in increasingly the case in other countries around the world too as well. So social media disinformation is important because it's there in the gateway to the world for people. It's where the stories shared between friends and people are more likely to be believed, maybe because it's coming from them. It's coming from someone you trust who shared it with you, and therefore you add credence to it. Now, over the last few months, we've seen this problem go from the context of politics, international politics and elections, to something which affects our lives more directly and more immediately, which is a public health emergency. In the case of a political campaign, someone may say, well, I don't think I would ever be swayed by something that I saw on Facebook. I don't think that would ever persuade me how to vote. But of course, the problem is the effect over a longer period of time rather than one individual story. But with something like coronavirus, where we think we know how it started, but we're not 100% sure. We think we know how it spread and where from, but we're not 100% sure. That is the perfect environment for disinformation to spread. And that disinformation can affect lives. Now, some people have always said to me on this subject, well, do people really believe it? Well, we've seen arson attacks on mobile phone masts because people are spreading rumors saying that that 5G mobile signals are the cause of coronavirus. In India, we've seen evidence of campaigns on WhatsApp where minority ethnic and religious groups have been targeted as being the spreaders of coronavirus and have been attacked within communities. We saw some polling published today by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which shows that about 1 in 6 people in the UK won't get a vaccine for coronavirus when one is available because they don't trust vaccines. And that there's evidence from that research as well that people that have been exposed to disinformation around coronavirus are more likely to believe conspiracy theories about it, less likely to want to take a vaccine. When we have the vaccine, which will probably be one of the ways we try and ultimately defeat coronavirus, and medical experts say we need about 85% of people to agree to be vaccinated. Well, if we have these sorts of numbers who are persuaded by anti-vaccine campaigns not to take it, then that job's going to be much harder. Already on social media, we've seen stories saying that in trials in Africa, 7 out of 9 children that received the vaccine died instantly on the spot. It's all lies, but it's all there, and it's all spreading through social media. Now, there is a question of what do we do about all of this? The organizations that are best placed to be our friends in trying to deal with this are the social media companies. They're the platforms through which disinformation spreads. And I've always believed they should have some sort of liability here. They're not neutral platforms, conduits of disinformation. They have a responsibility. And the reason I think that is that they ultimately make money from the audiences that gather on their platforms. If audiences are drawn to conspiracy theories or hate speech or aggressive behavior, if people are attracted towards that activity, then that is creating an audience which is monetized by the platforms. But more importantly, I think in terms of their responsibility, companies like Facebook and YouTube, they're not organic sites. When you go onto those platforms, you don't just see the last thing your friend posted. What you see is content that has been selected for you by the platforms themselves, chosen and selected to keep you there for as long as possible by holding your interest. There have been studies on YouTube, and I believe this data has come from the company itself, that say that 70% of what people watch on YouTube is played for them by the platform. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal recently, I think it was published in May, which was drawn on internal Facebook research that showed that, I think this was based on a study in looking at hate speech in Germany, that 64% of people who joined Facebook groups full of extremist content did so at the recommendation of Facebook. They're observing behavior and they're recommending more of it. So because these algorithms are driving people towards these content, I believe the companies have a responsibility to act against it. Now, within this always comes up the discussion about free speech and people's free speech rights. Clearly, the companies themselves have different interpretations of this. YouTube and Twitter have been more ready to take action against harmful disinformation, be that within political speech or medical conspiracy theories, more willing to do that than Facebook have been. so far. But I think where we can see that speech causes harm, there's always been that intervention. Free speech has never been an absolute right. It's always been qualified by the harm that can do other people. But even within that, people have the right to free speech, the right of expression. They don't have, within the right of free speech though, is not a right that what they say must be amplified by a social media network to reach millions of people every day. You know, they have a freedom of speech. They don't have a freedom of reach. They don't have a right to that reach through social media. Now, I believe that the social media companies should do more to act against harmful medical disinformation. When we want to see a successful vaccination campaign to defeat coronavirus, I think it would be unacceptable for medical conspiracy theories to undermine that, to be spreading like wildfire through social media. As we run into important elections, I don't believe people should be able to pay to lie in adverts where that's clearly a lie, clearly maybe damaging or defaming another person. They shouldn't be able to do that without any check. It shouldn't be something that Facebook say they won't check or intervene on. I think as well the swirling sort of storm of hate speech that we see on social media, attacking people, certainly people in the public eye, celebrities, sports people, because of the color of their skin or their religious beliefs. There shouldn't be something that is just part of our culture. We shouldn't just say, well, that's the way the world is now. We should just live with that. We should accept it. I think we should recognize this is causing harm. And I think there's some evidence to suggest it is radicalizing opinion, it is dividing communities. This isn't solely the responsibility of the social media companies, but I believe they've become a contributing factor in funneling these sentiments and these emotions. So my call would be, I think we need to have a system of oversight and regulation, where just as we have in broadcasting and other industries, where we recognize that big companies have almost not quite monopolistic powers. They're incredibly important. That what they do is incredibly important to public health and consumer health. There are obligations, there are rules of the road that are set for them to trade within. Doesn't mean to say they're told what to do by the government, but they have regulations to follow. That is normal in most industries, be it pharmaceuticals, banking, broadcasting, you name it. But it hasn't followed pace in technology in quite the same way. So I would say we need independent oversight. We need regulators with regulatory powers. We need clear standards on content that should be set, and responsibilities set for the tech companies. And we need these external bodies to enforce them and have the right to audit and inspect. We cannot just leave this to the companies to do for themselves. And I think for medical disinformation, I think for someone to be knowingly and maliciously and at scale spreading medical conspiracy theories with the intent of harming the public health, I think that should be an offence. I think we should make things like that an offence. I think it would be in the offline world, and it should be in the online world as well. And we need to safeguard as well, I say, particularly in the UK, I think we need to guard against the mission creep of American legislation into Europe on this matter as well, where the legal safe harbor liability protections that the big tech companies have in America shouldn't be exported around the world in trade deals. We should make sure the companies are held to account. Now, saying all of this, sometimes you can sound like, you know, I'm sort of anti-tech, I'm anti these platforms and companies. I'm not at all. They do amazing work in connecting the world, and they've made access to information much more readily available than it ever was before. But there are responsibilities that come with that as well. You know, just because you believe cars should have seatbelts, it doesn't make you anti-car. You know, so, and I think just because we think tech should have proper oversight, proper accountability, it doesn't make you anti-tech. There are many brilliant companies working in the UK and across Europe that are working to make technology safer and more accountable as well. And that's the way we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Can I just put one or two questions before we move on to Julie? How far do you think it's going to be possible for the United Kingdom to act on its own in this greater surveillance and policing in a legislative framework of tech companies? Is it really possible for any individual European country to do that? Doesn't it have to be done at the European level? And the other question I'd ask, if I may, is who do you think are these private individuals or private interests who have an interest in spreading this information? I can see state actors in certain circumstances would have an interest, but who would be the sort of private interest? Would they be big companies or billionaires, or who?
So in terms of can individual countries do their own thing? Well, yes, they can, and the tech companies have to abide by the laws in the countries where they trade. In Europe, and including the UK when it was a member of the EU, that's really underpinned by the e-commerce directive. But that requires illegal content to be taken down by the tech companies. But different countries have interpreted that in different ways. So in Germany, they require the removal of content that's in breach of the German hate speech laws. France has created a new law where during an election period, a judge can determine that a piece of information is disinformation and order it to be taken down within 48 hours. You go elsewhere around the world. Australia has set new legislation requiring the removal of violent content from social media platforms. Singapore's created its own disinformation law as well. So I think we can learn a lot from what other countries have been doing. So it can be done at a state level within the EU under current EU law. And I think in the UK we should be determining the standards and the rules that we want to see set and followed in our own country, and we can do that, and the tech companies would have to follow. Clearly, I think what we'll see around the world, though, is what I hope we'll see is a kind of leveling up, where countries develop responses that people think work and are effective, and people want to see similar standards applied in their country as well, just as we've done on data law, and certainly it's the UK's position to continue to work within EU data law as part of the GDPR legislation as well. So what we've done for data, I think we need to think of how we do for content in terms of creating responsibilities and then the power to enforce those responsibilities. The question then of who does it? Well, we've seen investigations demonstrating state actors doing it, particularly from Russia and China. We also see private individuals like David Icke. David, I would say I think whilst I think the social media companies should do more, I think during coronavirus they have started to make decisions on what I think in the past would have been seen as freedom of speech issues by deplatforming people like David Icke, who was spreading conspiracy theories about 5G being the cause of coronavirus and other things as well. And they took down his Facebook page, and YouTube removed his YouTube channels. So we see individuals that are motivated to behave in that way. Some people do it for money, because by creating sensationalist content that is effectively a form of clickbait. Others may do it to try and sort of shape political narratives and influence opinion, as people have always done. There's also, I think, questions then for the tech companies about whether their tools have made that too easy, and whether the tools they have should be modified. If you take political speech and advertising, YouTube have recognised that, and they've got rid of some of the data targeting tools for political ads. So you can't use those tools to micro-target political ads at people on YouTube, but you still can on Facebook. And I think that's something that probably has to change as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we're getting on to Julie, who comes more from the journalistic and academic side of the argument. She's the Global Director of Research at the International Centre for Journalists, Senior Researcher at the University of Sheffield, and a Research Associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. So she's very well qualified to tell us what she does in order to combat fake news and what she thinks other people can and should do to help her.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me as part of this conversation. I think the more we talk about this, it's clear that conversations that are full of facts and providing context are one way that we can actually counter disinformation and misinformation. And I'd agree with Damian to start off with that the term fake news does need to be problematized. And one of the reasons is that it has been weaponized, not just in the ways that Damian pointed out, but if I can speak specifically about the role of journalism as a potential, and we're talking critical, credible, ethical journalism here, as a potential bulwark against disinformation. We also need to acknowledge that journalists have found themselves at what I call the epicenter of risk, where hate speech, particularly gendered or racially charged hate speech, and disinformation intersect. And so journalists are finding themselves the targets of disinformation operatives and networks, not just in the sense that they are being misdirected, redirected, swamped with polluted data sets and so on, but also actively targeted with disinformation about them, designed to discredit them, to hold them up to ridicule, to do what Damian eloquently described as to leave them so confused, those people being the audience or the audiences, that they don't know who to trust or what to believe. And that's our greatest challenge and our greatest risk, I think. But this has also led to offline attacks on journalists, just as Damian described some of the attacks internationally that we've seen in reference to conspiracy theories like burning like wildfire offline as well as online. We've seen journalists physically targeted during coronavirus as potential vectors of the virus. with conspiracy theories around journalists, peddling disinformation, when in fact, of course, in most cases, what journalists are seeking to do is to ensure that people are able to be informed. It's in the public interest to have people informed about public health matters, of course. So I just wanted to make those points up front, and we can come back and talk more about those issues. But I think these are important points to note. And in fact, I wrote about this for CNN just last week, the issue of the platform's responsibility when it comes to dealing with journalists who are caught up in this swarm. And I think we have an emblematic case to consider in Maria Ressa, who is being persecuted and harassed in the Philippines as a journalist of international note in the context of a pandemic where the cloak of silence has descended. So let me just make that point now, and I'm stalling because I'm going to try and share my screen. And I'm going to share my screen to demonstrate. I'm sharing some research that I did for UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, if I get that acronym correct. Just checking you can see my screen share there?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. So this is representing two policy briefs that we published in April this year as the pandemic really started to take hold. So I produced these with Kalina Boncheva, who's a colleague at the University of Sheffield's Centre for Freedom of the Media. She's a computer scientist, and I come from a journalism studies and practice background. So this research, which was very much produced in collaboration with UNESCO and ICFJ's support as well, used the term disinfodemic to describe what we're dealing with in the context of this crisis when it comes to disinformation. And we did that to try to distinguish disinformation from information. So the World Health Organization and many others have coined the term infodemic to describe what's going on. We wanted to make the point that that encompassed both the overload of credible information, which is a mix of, say, reliable journalism in combination with government announcements about public health measures, for example, scientific papers and so on. And we wanted to distinguish that from the overload of misinformation and disinformation. Now, while I agree with what Damian said about understanding the distinctions between misinformation and disinformation, and we can define misinformation as false or misleading information that's shared without ill intent, for example. So a case in point might be my mother sending me a WhatsApp message from Australia with throat gargle cures for coronavirus, which we know has been widely debunked and is in fact inaccurate. And taking such information at face value could lead to dire consequences if you don't seek medical attention and you do in fact have coronavirus symptoms, of course. So she's sharing that probably with the best intentions. I should add, not that she's watching, but she didn't actually do that. That was by way of example. But disinformation traditionally would be understood as information that is shared with malicious intent. So information that is designed to mislead or cause harm and so on. Now, in the context of producing these policy briefs, we are also working with a much broader collection of international experts on a major report, which will hopefully be published in around September or October of this year, which analyses global responses to disinformation broadly. And we look at a whole range of actors. And we've adopted the same approach there, that approach being that we're referring to misleading content, false content, broadly as disinformation, where the impacts of that information are harmful. Now, we see that particularly in the context of coronavirus. Misinformation, misinformation, and Damian and I have talked about this before in another webinar with the President of the US suggesting that injecting bleach might be a potential cure for coronavirus. Now, people might want to debate whether that was intentional or not, but if we assume that it was not said with ill intent, it's misinformation, but at the same time, the impact could be devastating. Death could result, of course. And so what we've done is use the term disinformation to add some additional nuance to these discussions, because we're looking at the impact being equal between misinformation that's potentially deadly. And we could also argue that misinformation of the kind that led to genocide in Myanmar that spread like wildfire on Facebook early in 2018, we could argue that that was in fact also partly misinformation along with disinformation, but the impact was deadly, of course. So it's the deadly impact of the false content, irrespective of the intent behind it, that leads us to refer to disinformation broadly and the disinfodemic. Now, just to outline some differences and distinctions between COVID-19 related disinformation and political disinformation. Some of the things that we've observed so far are that the COVID-19 disinformation really is global and it is huge in terms of its scale. So it's transmitted very easily from country to country. And we're seeing this, I think, Damian, you might have just pointed this out. I've had so many of these conversations, they all start to blur. But we're seeing the export of conspiracy theories from the US, for example, conspiracies connected to masks being worn, inhibiting breathing. We're seeing the conspiracies that you definitely referred to around 5G towers, which led to fires here in the UK that had other impacts internationally. And we're seeing that the export of this kind of extreme thinking that's driven by some sort of correlation between people's desire to distrust governments and other institutions in combination with fanciful ideas with devastating consequences. As I said, it's a viral load of disinformation that we're dealing with. And we're seeing also, as Damian also indicated, more decisive responses from the social media companies that we often refer to as the platforms. And I would underline the point that the platforms is, I think, potentially a problematic term to keep using. It's their own language to describe themselves. These are not passive platforms or stands where information is simply plonked. They have an active role in disseminating misinformation and disinformation, and especially if we think about the algorithmic power to exponentially increase reach and also to target individuals as they know they do. And so we need to acknowledge, though, that the implications of some of the swift action that the platforms have taken, now that I've problematized that term, I'm going to start using it again, in reference to coronavirus and COVID-19 disinformation. So that has included the takedown of posts by, for example, the president of Brazil. And I just saw a news flash, which I should confirm before sharing with you, but I just got an alert suggesting that Jair Bolsonaro has in fact been diagnosed with coronavirus. It's something that someone in the audience might double check for me. It was a news alert.
It's on the BBC at the moment.
There you go.
I don't know if that proves it or not.
Well, I think that's a pretty credible source. So we're seeing, those kinds of actions where specific political disinformation that's about coronavirus or COVID-19 being pulled. There is a risk to freedom of expression that we need to acknowledge, that when there's an overzealousness around takedowns, you can end up with unintended consequences, to use the language of these companies again, which could inhibit accurate and important public health information being shared. And there was an example of that with Facebook through its automatic processes early on during the pandemic, inadvertently removing content. So we do need to be mindful of that. And I think that emphasizes the need for much more investment in human curation and human appeal processes to enable this to be properly managed. We cannot simply leave it to artificial intelligence. There is also stronger agreement, I guess, between the different communities that work to counter disinformation. So whether they be liberal democracies committed to ensuring that their citizens are able to access reliable, accurate information in the public interest in a timely manner, and that information should include public health information, or it is civil society organizations seeking to ensure that government responses to the coronavirus are still able to be scrutinised and challenged, for example. We're seeing, nevertheless, more of a desire to collaborate, both between private companies that run these platforms and also through governments, news organisations, and so on. And I think, Damian, you're involved directly in some of that within the UK. And we're seeing a really high volume of fact-checking activity, but these memes, these potent disinformation stories, the wearing a mask will kill you, gargling water will cure it, particularly 5G conspiracy theories, there's a whole range of them that are perpetual and seem to gain momentum, no matter how many ways we try to fact check, debunk, and so on. So I just want to run you through some of the trends we identified, specifically through our research, and we examined a range of databases, including those maintained by the International Press Institute and also the Index on Censorship civil society organisation, which identified human rights abuses connected to coronavirus, particularly around freedom of expression, and the fact-checking databases maintained by the International Fact-Checking Network. And we found 9 key themes that were emerging, this being, of course, data from the first 2 months of the pandemic that we're commenting on here. So the first theme was the origins and spread of coronavirus. So we saw a lot of racist tropes associated with that. So a lot of racism connected to Asian people, because there remains a view, a consensus view, I suppose, that the disease COVID-19 from coronavirus originated in China. And then we also saw the pollution of statistics, false and misleading statistics, particularly around the incidence of the disease. Only young people get it. People of colour are immune, these kinds of falsehoods. And mortality rates also, the pollution of data sets around mortality rates. Economic impacts, we still see this, and I'd say we see it increasingly in certain contexts, including in the US and in my own country, Australia, where I'm from originally. We're seeing arguments put that falsely claim that the economic impacts of coronavirus are worse than the disease itself, therefore opening up should happen more quickly than is perhaps scientifically or medically advised. We're seeing, and I've mentioned this already, so I won't underline it anymore, other than to repeat that the discrediting of journalists and credible news organisations is a deliberate strategy, whether that's through what we call patriotic troll networks, where previously journalists have been demonised and harassed in the context of political reporting. Now they're seeing that ramp up in reference to coronavirus. Then we see a whole suite of disinformation around medical science and the symptoms, the diagnosis and the treatment. Impacts on the environment. I mean, one of my favourite ones, apart from the toilet paper race, based on the false notion that we're about to run out of toilet paper, is the appearance in Venetian canals, or reappearance allegedly, of dolphins, which was a pretty sticky story that duped even some credible news organisations. There are no dolphins in the Venetian canals, despite the re-emergence of wildlife elsewhere in the context of many of us retreating to our homes and the wildlife resurgence that we're seeing. Now, politicisation, I think, is an important one. And Damian, I find what you say really refreshing. And I think one of the problems that we have had historically is this increasing combat between credible journalism and politics, where the journalists and the credible journalism become targeted by many political actors, and there's a reluctance, to call out political disinformation or political actors where there might be an alignment of, political beliefs, for example. And so I think, it's actually really, as a former political journalist, refreshing for me to hear Damian speak so candidly about some of the political figures who might be considered to be more closely aligned with his politics. I think that's part of the solution. We need a robust debate always, but we need to ensure that facts are front and centre and that debunking can occur across boundaries. Number 8, content driven by fraudulent financial gain. Now, I think this is one that's important to point out and to perhaps consider elaborating on. Facebook's current position, for example, is that disinformation is only that which is peddled for profit. Now, that would include some of the more frightening elements of disinformation in the ecosystem, such as so-called black propaganda units, which is, PR firms specializing in disinformation, which is something that reporters like Jane Litvinenko at BuzzFeed and Craig Silverman have focused on and really done some excellent exposés. And we've seen that in other cultural contexts like South Africa as well. But that's problematic because disinformation can cause, and misinformation can cause, deadly impacts regardless of whether they are in fact designed to be profitable. And we've also found celebrity-focused disinformation. Daniel Radcliffe, who played Harry Potter, of course, was one of the people falsely identified as having coronavirus early on. And I think I'll wrap up because I'm conscious that I'm not paying any attention to time, and I probably should be. But just to highlight,
if you could wrap up, that would.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing now. So just to highlight these 4 types of conveyors, if you like, for disinformation. So these are the 4 main formats that we found connected to disinformation distribution. So there's emotive constructs and memes. We know that emotion is a very powerful driver of disinformation. It can also be a very powerful driver for social change, but we should be noting that. We're seeing an increase in fabricated websites and false identities, and that, to point 4, involves them infiltrating networks, seeding discord, and orchestrating campaigns, and also particularly decontextualized images and video and audio, I should say, which are not limited to the so-called deep fakes, which are these synthetic videos. But the idea of decontextualizing is a very powerful way to mislead people. And I'll leave it there. I'll put a link in the comments so that people can freely access those briefs if they're interested, in the chat, I mean.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Very, very informative. Can I ask a question? It's
Sure.
Specifically about COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
Is the formula or the criterion whereby you judge fake news or disinformation changed by the fact that, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, there is a certain amount of disagreement between scientists on what is the nature and transmission mechanism of the virus, and that particularly plays into another concern I have, which is the role of WHO.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does seem to me you don't have to be a fan of Donald Trump to wonder whether the WHO has played as entirely authoritative a role in the description and analysis of COVID-19 as in an ideal world it might have done.
Yeah, I think those are 2 really useful and important points, actually, and they highlight some of the complexities. So information is not static is the first thing. And I think within the context of journalism, we learned this and we struggled with this when social media first arrived. So if I can use my journalistic examples, a story or an incident will change over time. So you might arrive at the scene of some kind of disaster. If you are reporting information that's been given to you by officials at the scene of the disaster at hour 0, which you have reason to believe is accurate, and that information changes over time as new evidence emerges, then that does not make it misinformation or disinformation. I think that's so. And when it comes to science, one of the real risks we face, and I'm not a scientist in the sense of medical or biological science, but one of the risks we face is the rush to publish prior to the sort of traditional peer review processes. And I think there's a balance there. So it's really important to be able to understand science in motion because of the urgency and the emergency that we face. But that is going to lead to an evolution of ideas and evidence over time. And we have to accept that that's something different to misinformation and disinformation. It might be problematic because, information of scientific research nature is entering the public sphere prior to a consensus or a peer review process. but we need to be cautious about assuming that information is false if it's in fact evolving over time. And to your other point about WHO, I think this, or the World Health Organization, I think we risk through, and I've seen this even among journalist friends in the UK and internationally, but particularly in the UK, really rallying behind the UK government's response, for example, without critical thinking, feeling a sense of patriotism, almost warlike, that these responses to the crisis should be accepted without critique. And I think that's problematic. And I'm sure, Damian, you would agree that all policy needs to be interrogated and challenged and held up to the light. And I think we could argue the same is true with WHO. There's almost a reluctance to criticize the institution that's kind of at the helm on the one hand, and the sense that you're perhaps siding with the disinformation purveyors if you're being critical of the World Health Organization. It's a recalibration in process, I guess.
Can I just stress my question was only about the WHO. I wasn't suggesting there should be any unconditional loyalty to the policies of the British government. Jurgis, if I may, Jurgis Vilcinskas, thank you very much for joining us from Brussels. Obviously, the Commission has been very active on the External Action Service has been very active in both these areas of disinformation from state actors, anti-democratic, politically manipulative disinformation, and also in the more recent pandemic. So anything you want to tell us about those two topics, we'd be very interested to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Brendan, for invitation, and big thanks for the previous speakers. I think, usually it's very hard to speak the third, in a row. But I think after these two enlightening pitches before me, I feel like I can sort of focus maybe a little bit more on the European dimension of how we in the EU, both at the institutions level, at the member states level, try to tackle this phenomena. And I think to start with, I mean, we all agree, I think, that disinformation is not really only about spreading false information. It is really about influence, it is about manipulation, it's about shaping, bending public debate, polarizing it, if you like it. It is very much about elections interfering. If you look from national security perspective, it's very much part of the hybrid warfare, which was, by the way, probably the cause of one of the biggest recent security crises in Europe in 2014 in Ukraine. And the fact is that we see both at the policymakers level, at media level, that disinformation actors are really, very smart, if you like, exploiting our vulnerabilities. I mean, vulnerabilities, whether they might come in our communication, interpersonal or interstate, exploiting social media algorithms, who usually, as I think Julie mentioned already, favor engagement, over accuracy, exploiting all kind of cognition traps that we have. And I think really it's very important that we start sort of on a very solid ground, as Damian said. We start really with defining sort of with what we are dealing with, what is the threat, how to define it, because otherwise we cannot build our resilience to it. And then the third sort of intro pitch for me is that disinformation is something which is definitely harmful, something which is definitely intentional, but it's not illegal, right? We cannot have this silver bullet solution, just sort of ban certain, media outlets who push out disinformation, probably on behalf of actors out there externally, out of the EU. We cannot, take down all the, Twitter accounts that we expect of peddling the same stuff. So it's really something that we have to approach very sensitively, and have to approach kind of in what we call Brussels whole of society way. So, both having the media on board, civil society on board, governments on board, fact checkers, and many, many others. If I turn a little bit to our angle, the European External Action Service, I mean, how we approach this issue, I think we very much sort of deal with it along the model of ABCD that probably some of you are aware. I mean, A basically stands for the actor. So we try to look, of course, who is trying to disrupt our info ecosystem, you know, and why. And of course, I mean, if you look at the recent figures, I mean, disinformation is totally global phenomena. I think there are more than 50 states out there who are capable to running out quite sophisticated disinformation campaigns. So we can't look at all of them. We look at very specific actors, and actually the team that I'm working with has also very specific mandate from European Council to address Russian disinformation campaigns. So a lot of the tools that we have in our pocket in our daily work is actually calibrated, let's say, to detect and to expose Russian disinformation attacks. But on the other hand, I mean, this is the issue with the actor. The other thing I think we look is the behavior, you know, and this is another worrying thing, because, you know, we have, I think, now a history of 5 years, let's say, that we deal with this issue in-house in External Action Service, and we see that, you know, the number of techniques and ways how we are being deceived, both online and offline, they really are, let's say, improving, and very often we are playing a catch-up game, you know, with the let's say with the adversaries. We of course have, let's say, facts on our side, truth on our side, and you know, we collect the evidence, I think, for those disinfo attacks, you know, that target, for example, European Union or its allies in the neighborhood. I invite everybody to look, you know, at the EU versus disinfo.eu website. We have a publicly available database with now 9,000 disinformation cases, out of which more than 500 are already related to coronavirus. So you can see that, you know, coronavirus is kind of at least a big game changer in 2020, because it really became, I think, a perfect decoy for many state and non-state actors actually to push their political or financial agendas forward. Yeah, and I think then the last sort of thing besides content is, of course, the distribution. You know, the way disinformation is being distributed. I think both previous speakers mentioned we have so many, let's say, deficiencies at the moment, how to break down these distribution networks, because of course, if it is happening online, if media consumption is, let's say, moving online, then of course we need to have much more transparency what's happening on the platforms, disinformation wise. You know, we need to have much more transparency on the algorithms. We have to sort of, it's a little bit, we come to the point that, you know, digital infrastructure just becomes the same infrastructure as, you know, energy grids or roads. And of course, you know, then the question is, can this infrastructure still be, you know, part of voluntary sort of rules, voluntary regulation, or whether at one day you know, European states or globally even states decide, you know, how to regulate that infrastructure to make it really more transparent, more responsible for the consumers. Now, maybe if I a little bit move to what we have seen in terms of the disinformation around coronavirus, and just couple of weeks ago, actually, both the Commission and External Action Service issued what we call communication, basically a policy paper about lessons learned on disinformation in COVID times, and also proposing a number of, let's say, short-term measures, sort of solutions that we can take now at the member states level to tackle the issue. And in terms of lessons learned, I mean, definitely what we've concluded is that our adversaries will take advantage of the situation. So if the situation is dominated, in infosphere with uncertainty and fears, definitely, they will be there to push out conspiracies, to push out the phishing mails, offering magical cures. So it's kind of they will be there. And of course, on the positive side, on the other hand, I mean, one of the lessons we've learned was that if there is a will, there is a way to get forward. And especially, I think on the platform side, I mean, we've seen some great examples. Platforms kind of doing things that several months ago they said were very difficult to do, promoting authoritative information, demoting some of the content. So there was clearly a move there as well. And definitely we saw what kind of role independent media has to play in the whole setup, because it was really there kind of to tackle some of the worst conspiracies and the myths. And now the problem is, unfortunately, that COVID is very fast destroying a lot of these independent voices, because, media in the EU and also in its neighborhood actually losing a large chunk of revenues, closing down essentially, or selling off to financial groups and becoming less independent. So this is, I think, also a big issue, or sort of the big threat for us, where we all need, I think, to provide the support for these outlets in the year, so that they can basically help us grow healthy and effective. Now, in terms of the themes itself on the coronavirus, I mean, I think, if I sort of try to recall the history, I think the first case in our disinformation database came in on January 22nd. And this was actually a disinformation case from one of the media outlets that we monitor, which is Russian state-funded Sputnik News. And it talked about a virus which is man-made and which is actually created by NATO. So one of the pillars, let's say, of the Western security architecture. And, we moved fast forward a few months. I mean, we saw a lot of mutations on this narrative, claiming that US biological laboratories on the former territories of Soviet republics actually were sort of producing and spreading the viruses. And here the interesting thing was that some of this narrative, unfortunately, was also spread by the Chinese official media, which probably sort of used it also to distract, as an attempt to distract international community from China's initial handling of COVID outbreak there in China. So, I mean, definitely in terms of the big clusters, I mean, what we saw with our capabilities, our listening tools, I think there was a lot of disinformation about COVID linked to the 5G networks, a lot of conspiracy theories about, deep state using virus to depopulate the world or to achieve financial gains. And then, of course, you had a lot of scapegoating, guys like Bill Gates, George Soros, were always there kind of, waiting for coronavirus to get even more powerful. And, unfortunately, a lot of this is actually spread with a very clear intention, with having a well-organized, let's say, ecosystem, especially the pro-Kremlin ecosystem, which we sort of have more clear ideas how it functions. But it's, again, as I said in the beginning, it's not so easy kind of to dismantle this ecosystem quickly. And I'm sure the big future battleground would be basically how we deal with the issue of communicating around vaccines in probably early in 2021, because a lot of current disinformation actors are very much supporting anti-vax movements, other fringe movements in general, and here, of course, we have to respond, and the best response probably is not, let's say, to not only by debunking disinformation, but also becoming much better in strategic communications. I mean, bottom line, we have to talk about European values, about strong European identity. These are probably the things that can rally citizens and civil society organizations around, and this could really help us bring our own agenda on the table. And here again, I mean, we have to connect better with the member states. We're doing it at European level via so-called Rapid Alert System platform. By the way, United Kingdom is also part of it in a way, because it's also has a G7 and let's say a NATO platform included. And we have also to strengthen, I mean, definitely, I mean, significantly sort of quadruple, if you like, our partnerships with the researchers, with sociologists, with academia, to basically to understand, what is the impact of disinformation out there, how we can better debunk it, how we can quicker fact check it and quicker sort of get it out of the online platform. So, I mean, basically, if I stop here, I mean, the agenda in front of us, I mean, the complexity of the issue is amazing. And the good thing, of course, that at European level, this is well understood now. I mean, it's not anymore, a black swan like it was 5 years ago. Now, I mean, it's really a mainstream policy area. And by the end of the year, European Commission will come up with some major policy documents on that, especially the European Democracy Action Plan, which will look also in the issues like elections integrity, in the issues of media freedom, and also in the issue of disinformation. So I'll stop here, Brendan. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Can you just develop the last point a bit, which I suppose was the Commission's plans to improve its strategic communications and its links with the member states. How do you see that as working out? Because that's an aspiration that people have had for a long time for the European Union. What now is going to be different that will be more successful than it has been in the past? Not that it's been wholly unsuccessful in the past, but there have always been gaps that people think needed to be filled.
Indeed, no. I think that I think generally strategic communications is now one of the, let's say, one of the trending topics in public administration, if you like, because I think now really majority of people understand that without actually having communication an integral part of policy making, you won't be able really, to move your initiative much forward, because the people will not be, will not understand them, will not be informed about its benefits, impacts. So what we of course do at our own external action service, which is diplomatic service, first of all, I mean, we run quite a number of communication campaigns, both in EU, but also in our neighborhood, explaining essentially, what EU stands for, what are the benefits of our partnerships with the third countries, and also in many cases directly tackling the disinformation about European Union in these countries, because we are, frankly, we are the target very often of these disinformation campaigns, and our reputation is being, in many countries very sophisticatedly attacked. So we have to really be there. We have to understand, research the information environment. We have to be ready to come up there with a strong message and have also the network behind, you know, to let's say, to pass this message. The network could be, you know, our alumni, it could be our EU delegations in 140 capitals around the world, but it could be also, you know, good social media campaigns. I mean, one campaign we just finished running last week on Syria, and you know, even without major financial resources, if you have the message, if you have the right multipliers, you can achieve amazing results. So we have to be definitely much more assertive on that.
Good, thank you very much indeed. We've got a limited number of questions, I think, because the speakers were so good and so comprehensive. People can't yet think of many questions, but we're getting one or two more. But I think the first question that I'd like to put, which has come up in several interventions from the floor, is the question of whether it's possible by something like the findings of a judge in France, really to prevent rumors generated by social media from getting a grip. Damian rightly mentioned the French arrangement whereby a judge has the right to demand something to be taken down in 48 hours. Is that going to make any difference? Won't it, in that 48 hours, the rumor have taken wing in a way that will be very difficult to check? But then there's another question that people have put, which goes to that same issue. Do you think that there would be within the political society of the West, of Europe, of America, a political consensus sufficient to introduce a sort of legislation, restricting legislation that both Julie and Damian, and by implication Jurgis, have advocated? Could we perhaps go in the reverse order? Perhaps ask Jurgis first, then Julie, then Damian, if that's all right.
Yeah, so on the legal action, you know, I think it looks maybe from the first sight quite attractive option, right? You know, you issue the order and you sort of remove it from everywhere, you know, and then it's gone. But you know, just to think about sort of rumors or conspiracies that are spread, I don't know, let's say in the closed Facebook groups or WhatsApp encrypted services, you know, these things you can't detect, you can't remove, you know, it's still going on. So I mean, my answer, you know, to this thing, and I'm not a legal expert, I mean, would be to look for a bit more comprehensive solution, you know, the one I think we are kind of, if you like, advocating now at the European level, you know, by trying to create an information environment which is, let's say, where critical thinking and where actions of different, let's say, players really reinforce our resilience to such, you know, to such, for example, to such conspiracies or myths. So it's, I think this kind of resilient ecosystem society, if you like, this is what we should focus on building on so much. Probably not looking, you know, for an easy ways out.
Good.
I pass on to Julie.
Unmute. You can hear the old mute game on Zoom. I think one thing I'd like to highlight is the importance of ensuring that legislative responses and legal and judicial responses need to be mindful of the very serious threats to freedom of expression that we are seeing. And those of you who download, I put some links in the chat to the UNESCO briefs, and the biggest study that's coming out later this year very much views this problem of disinformation, and in the case of the disinfodemic briefs, that connected to COVID-19, through a freedom of expression lens. And so as much as we are making recommendations that suggest regulation to support, say, for example, Facebook being forced to acknowledge that it's a publisher, which has associated with it certain responsibilities that many of us would argue they're shirking currently. We need to be mindful that this disinformation crisis is being used in many countries around the world as a cloak, as a cover for instituting so-called fake news laws, for example. And these fake news laws, even if they're established with the best intent to try and protect societies from potentially deadly mis or disinformation, then we're seeing these being applied in ways that restrict the access of journalists to information and restrict the access of citizens to information in many cases as well, but also restrict the publication of certain information. So there's an attempt in many countries around the world, and the databases I mentioned earlier, particularly Index on Censorship and the International Press Institute, have been gathering examples of these kinds of breaches, where either the misapplication or the extension of laws, arguing that it's necessary in a crisis like COVID-19 to increase these legal restrictions on disinformation. We're seeing it either catch journalism, independent journalism in the net, leading to arrests, leading to some of the physical attacks that I mentioned before, and jail time. I mean, some of these laws are instituted with 5 years of jail time attached to them. And I think, so I would say that it's important, therefore, to be mindful when responding to this crisis, and it is a genuine crisis in parallel with the physical crisis, and the medical crisis is a crisis of disinformation. And it should embolden us to deal with the crisis that and the threat that disinformation poses to democracy. But we need to be mindful of those parallel risks. And to the point that was made by one of the audience members about, by the time they get around to taking some of this down, it's already done its damage. That's true. And it's very hard to permanently eliminate a piece of disinformation or deadly misinformation from the information ecosystem. But we certainly need to try. And I think the point that Jurgis made about is really important, that one of the ways we try to do this is not just through regulating with regards to the platforms and pushing them at a moral and ethical level to do more, to recognize the harms that they're amplifying and facilitating. But as Jurgis said, we need to come at it from the other perspective too, which is to reinforce and support and value critical independent journalism. And that means, of course, public service broadcasting as much as it means independent in the private sense. There are different definitions around the world. But I think it's important that collectively, those of us who want to defend truth and access to it understand those two aspects as well.
Good. Damian.
Thank you. Yes, I think the first question you cited is a judge ordering to take down a piece of content a particularly effective response? Well, if that's all it was, then the answer would be no, because and I think in some ways we shouldn't look at this as a kind of a job of a kind of whack-a-mole game of going around trying to just take down individual posts. I think in some ways we've ended up in that position because the main response when there is a problem with disinformation is to go to Facebook, go to YouTube and say, will you take down this individual piece of content, which we believe is in breach of your guidelines and is harmful. I think what's a more effective remedy is to say, there are certain standards that we want to set. And in identifying these examples, it's about establishing standards that we want you to meet. And that's why I think what's so important, the most important thing here is having a system where you have an independent external regulator that can audit the companies and sets and determine whether or not they're meeting the standards that have been set for them, whether they enforce their own community guidelines, whether they meet other requirements we might put in place around acting against harmful content. Now, I think, if, for example, we had deep fake films, so fabricating a fake film of a politician saying something they'd never said in a place they'd never been, and that was circulating during an election campaign. I think for the response to that be from the tech companies, well, we'll flag on it that some people dispute whether it's real or not, but we're not going to do anything about it. And for that company's systems to be used to aggressively push that fake film at voters, I think we think that was it would be a nonsensical position. That's not about free speech. It's about someone trying to cheat the system and mislead people about something really important. I feel the same way about people doing something similar around anti-vaccine campaigns as well. So the standards there, but it's not about saying that individual bit of content should be taken down. It's about saying, for you as a company, you should have systems in place to act against this sort of thing happening. If you can identify networks of accounts that are the main conduits for this information spreading, you should do something about those accounts. Or if they're closed groups or channels with very large audiences, you should do something about that. Your systems monitor the platform to identify behavior, trends, things people are interested in. That same technology can be used to identify the bad stuff too. And what we want you to do is more readily act against that before it gets into the public eye. There's never been a sort of audit of how content spreads around an atrocity like the Christchurch terrorist attack. What were the key networks of groups that were influential in spreading that content through the system early? What follow-up action was taken against them? Did anyone lose their account as a consequence of doing that? These are the sorts of questions we need the answers to. And we have it in other sectors. That's what it says in closing on this, is that if someone was laundering money through a bank and the bank didn't spot it, the bank could lose its license. The bank can't say, well, no one told me, I thought it looked dodgy, but no one complained, no one said anything about it, so I didn't do anything. But that is Facebook's defense or other tech companies' defense at the moment. They're not required to be proactive on this stuff. And we've left it to them to decide when they're going to intervene or not. And that's what has to change. And I think you need a regulatory framework around that. Well, the job of the regulators is to say, we don't expect you to get it right 100% of the time, but we expect you to try. And if you get it wrong, then we will intervene. Just as on GDPR, we intervene on data breaches and we impose we can impose big fines. We need something similar on content, and that's going to be an ongoing process.
Can I make a couple of points, Brendan, in response to what Damian said there? I mean, I think one of the things we haven't discussed yet is the sort of civil society response to disinformation, particularly targeting Facebook this month. There's a campaign called Stop Hate for Profit. And I think what we're all getting at here is these measures are really important that everybody's discussing. But at the heart of this problem is a business model that serves hate and disinformation. And I found it particularly interesting that Facebook issued a statement categorically denying that they profited from hate speech last week. And I'm laughing because the business model is very much predicated on amplifying and targeting information and advertising connected to that. And there are so very many examples of the problems associated with the profitability of amplifying content, regardless of whether it is damaging or otherwise. And I'd like to hear from Damian and Jurgis about that as well. And the second point is just Damian just underlined this. We don't know what the mechanisms and the trends where we have no capacity to do big data analysis on the live streaming of the massacre in New Zealand or the genocide in Myanmar, because most editors, I'm going to say editors and journalists, most researchers are precluded from accessing that data. We need to have, whether it's a requirement or an understanding that there needs to be more transparency within these companies to enable, in a privacy respecting way, access to data that allows the sort of interrogation that we're talking about to demonstrate how do we counter this if we don't know precisely where it begins? What are the, from a language analytics perspective, what are the terms that get most traction? How is, with network analysis, how are these groups connected to one another and how does it spread with such speed, and how do we intervene to disrupt these networks in the moment, not through takedowns called coordinated inauthentic behavior in Facebook parlance after the fact. So I think these are two kind of action points that would be great to hear from our colleagues on.
Jurgis, perhaps you can respond and then go back to Damian. I think you had to unmute yourself. Unmute.
Yeah, indeed. Sorry. Maybe I'll take the second one. I don't know. Maybe I'm giving just a too simple answer, but I think definitely since the platforms became basically, a platforms of conversation, of linking up the people, linking up the businesses, I think definitely, we have to insist, that these online platforms really intensify information sharing practices with researchers, or with civil society organizations, or as Damian mentioned, independent sort of those who can do the independent audit in a way, you know. So far, I think what we have seen, I mean, in the voluntary arrangements, and we have several largest platforms actually as a participants of code of practice at European level. I don't think it is really enough, not adequate, you know, to resolve the issues that we have at hand. And, you know, the fact that, you know, for example, if we take the Facebook, that there is no sort of API, let's say, connection, you know, for even the independent researchers out there, not to speak about, you know, governments. This speaks volumes, I think. Over to Damian.
Please.
Well, I think the big thing of responsibility for the companies is the way their tools work. Julie said it goes back to the business model. So it's I think there are things they can do to identify disinformation and harmful content, inauthentic behavior and activity on their site. And they do a lot of that already. The really question is the process of amplification. That's where they're responsible. Their systems recommend content to users. And that then, I think for me, is very much their area of responsibility. And the area where I think we could intervene and say, well, you know, you fail in your responsibility because your systems have been promoting harmful content to other users. You know, and the business model of some of these tech companies, and not all tech companies, but their business model is they're advertising businesses, and the data that they gather, the purpose of that data is powerful because it groups people together. It connects people together. So if I live in Glasgow and like ABBA, I can easily meet other people that live in Glasgow and like ABBA. And a business that wants to advertise to people in Glasgow who like ABBA has got a ready tool to do it. And that's what it was built to. That's what it does. But the trouble is, it also means if I'm a fascist living in Europe, I can meet other fascists in Europe quite easily. And in fact, the LA Times even discovered that you could buy an ad category on Facebook of people that had an interest in high-ranking Nazis and use that to target them. So these are the things. This is where the tools that have been used to sell ads to make money for the business can also be used to do really bad things that create the ecosystem for harmful content to spread. And that's where they are responsible, in my mind. They can't be held liable necessarily for everything, you know, your granny posts on Facebook to her friends. But what they can be held responsible for is the way their tools allow the amplification of harmful content, either by external actors or just through their own recommendation systems. And even in America now, there are politicians who say that is not covered by the First Amendment. You know, that is not freedom of speech. That is a business model that you've got and is leading to harm. And I think that is something where you think, what is the role for regulatory intervention and responsibilities being placed? I think it can be built around things like that.
One more question, which is the intersection between disinformation on public health issues, and particularly COVID-19, and politics. Are the people who are inclined to believe a certain kind of disinformation about COVID-19 the same people who fall into a particular political category, not least in the United States? And then perhaps I can broaden it a little more. We've been talking about fake news, and quite rightly, we've been talking about platforms and the social media implications of fake news. But isn't the prevalence and the amplification of fake news at the technical level also a reflection that in at least one country, the United States of America, the guiding political principle of the ruling party of the president is precisely fake news? And fake news, in the rather subtle definition that Damian gave of it, that it's not just a question of wanting to persuade people that something's true, but making you doubt your own judgment. You don't know what's true. It seems to me that Twitter and Donald Trump are a marriage made in heaven. And perhaps we don't concentrate quite enough on the political problems of Donald Trump, and we concentrate to the exclusion of his fundamental political challenge to the system on the technical question. Can I begin with you, Julie, to disagree with that, if you do?
You know, I'm a former political journalist. I'm not going to disagree with the need to really scrutinize the sources of disinformation, not just the mechanisms for distributing disinformation. And I think it's probably useful to draw attention here to some research done by my colleagues, former colleagues at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Scott Brennan and Felix Simon and others, from a report which was published around the same time actually as these disinfodemic briefs. And really interesting data from that study is that while politicians accounted for about, I'm just going to have to estimate here from memory, 30% of the sources of disinformation that they identified from a sample of about 300 pieces of debunked or fact-checked mis and disinformation connected to COVID-19, they had something like a 70% rate of traction or engagement. So they were disproportionately likely, these sproutings from political actors, to influence others. Celebrities were in the same category as the politicians, I should say. It's not just the politicians. But so when you get, I think it's Woody Harrelson talking about, 5G towers, or you get Donald Trump talking about injecting bleach or whatever, pick your example, it's more likely to find traction. It is therefore possibly, arguably, more dangerous. And I would certainly strongly argue that while it's journalism's job, critical independent journalism's job, to hold power to account, and that includes politicians, it includes governments, it includes state apparatus, we have more than ever, I think, since World War II, a need for political actors who have integrity, who speak truth, who refuse to use, for example, the kinds of black PR firms, the kinds of targeting that have been associated with disinformation networks. And so that's my strong view as a fierce defender of the role of independent journalism, but also as a citizen. I'm so tired of the polarization that comes from active combat and the energy that is needed to be exerted by journalists simply trying to interview political actors in a way that extracts truth. And I'm excluding you from this, Damian, because in my experiences so far, it's been, as I said, so refreshing, but that is an experience that many journalists repeat over and over. We need to align ourselves, those of us who are invested in truth, and there are many variations of truth, I accept. But if we don't get political actors with integrity, and we don't ensure that journalism is not captured by corrupt political actors, for example, we're going to ultimately be fighting a losing battle. I would agree with that, and I'd be interested to know from Damian and others, whether there is perhaps a need for some kind of compact where, political parties, political actors in Western liberal democracies actually take a stand like some of the corporate actors have done, and to refuse to, play with Facebook's targeted advertising tools in the context of an election. I realize that's a very big ask, but I'm wondering, as we all kind of try to study our motivations and our involvement in all of this and how we're caught up, whether that's something to consider.
I think that's so difficult a question that we'll ask Jurgis first and give Damian time to think about how he's going to respond to it. Jurgis, would you like to respond?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a little bit other angle, and look in this issue from the perspective, of influence operations, foreign influence operations, that are targeting, unfortunately, European Union and European Union member states, and there, of course, local politicians probably, kind of, can become, either the victims, or the players that play into these narratives. But the issue here is that, if you have states, and we have, I think, more, let's say, more knowledge about Russian disinformation campaigns, I think many of these campaigns really pull forward the narratives, sort of elites versus the people, that don't trust your governments, all politicians manipulate the people, they never achieve good results, or, your values are being threatened, sort of, LGBTI or financiers or, you know, gays or anybody sort of set the political agenda, or you are all sort of dependent on United States, and, you know, you have like your country's lost sovereignty years ago already and can't do anything, and basically, you know, we're gonna soon collapse, you know, all become a colonies. When you have kind of this narratives pushed in a very systemic way, you know, using a number of media, which speaks the state-owned media, state-financed media, speaking a lot of languages, and when this thing is amplified, you know, on the platforms, you know, via messenger services, and you know, even sort of unintentionally amplified, then, you know, by conspiracy sort of groups that already exist in the West, or the proxies, then of course you have another sort of layer of complication. To try to keep this, you know, keep society cohesive, keep society on the same, let's say, understanding of values, and the same understanding of identity, you know, because if you break down society, if you fragment it, you know, into political clans, groups, you know, according to their beliefs and other things, then I think our adversaries will succeed. You know, we will not have this underlying sort of openness mood in our democracies. We will stop trusting our institutions, and we will start fighting each other. You know, I mean, whether it's on Facebook or on any other future online platforms. So this, we really have to be really, I think, mindful of that, and we need to think very hard on our responses, with keeping in mind that freedom of expression and, you know, is the key thing, and cannot be sort of a victim of this response. Over to Damian.
Good, thank you very much. Damian.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting that Joe Biden has made an issue of some of these things as part of his election campaign. He's actually issued a challenge to Facebook on targeted political advertising by candidates and by political action committees, and, you know, has asked them to call out, to stop, to call out people who are lying through political ads, to make them intervene, say they must intervene where they can see their tools are being abused, and particularly their ad tools are being abused by political campaigns. And that's a new thing. I mean, it's just, I imagine he's done it because that's what he believes, and I agree with him on all of those points that he's raised. But he obviously believes that this is an election issue too, and therefore that people are getting sick of social media being a kind of sort of whirlpool of hate, and want the companies to take more of responsibility. People's main concerns may be less about political disinformation and more about, you know, young people self-harming because of content they've seen, or the radicalization of people to join terror groups, or there could be or medical conspiracy theories that affect people's health directly. Whatever it is, I think there's a growing call for something to be done about this. And the polling I mentioned earlier on, that was published today by YouGov, also shows, you know, the public want to see, you know, legal measures brought in place to make the tech companies take more responsibility, or there to be genuine sanctions and consequences if they don't. So I think the public mood is shifting a bit on this, and that is important, because there is this like danger. If nothing is done, we could move into a media landscape where really what we used to call sort of proper journalism or journalism is a kind of luxury, it's a kind of niche product. The people that are prepared to pay for it, to read it behind the paywall, that will be their experience of news. For most other people though, their experience of news will be the swirl of what they see on social media. We will replace news editors with an algorithm, you know, and that algorithm will determine what people see. And the successful politicians in an environment like that won't be those that sit down and have meaningful conversations over important issues with informed, intelligent journalists and academics. There'll be people that have got the biggest personal following on social media. They will use, as Donald Trump does effectively, is to use social media to bypass the media to talk to the public directly in a way where there are not the same checks and balances. And that is a dangerous place for democracy to be. There's a lot more to being a democracy than holding elections, as we all know, you know, and therefore, and the right of proper debate, proper scrutiny, proper questioning, and the role of a free media, we know are all vital components of what a healthy democracy looks like. So I think we should say this is not just about this election cycle or that president or that politician. It's a recognition that if we do nothing, we are not just undermining the media, we're undermining the whole of our political society. And we cannot let that happen just for the sake of the business model of a couple of big technology companies. And I think it, but the optimistic note I would end on is that we're having this discussion now. I've had many discussions like this, many meetings like this over the last couple of years. We weren't having these discussions 4 years ago, not in a meaningful way, and not in a way where, and I think what coronavirus has done is it is the first public health emergency in the age of social media disinformation. And I think it's made people focus on these issues, the cause of these issues, and what amplifies this bad content more than they ever have done before. And therefore, I think the public acceptance now for something to be done, the requirement of standards to be met, and for social media companies to do more, I think is greater now than it has probably been since this new era began.
Good, thank you very much. I don't think any of you specifically answered the question that was put: is there an overlap between political conspiracy theorists and COVID conspiracy theorists?
So I can give you a view on that if you want. But
yeah, I'm going to say yes, but do you agree with that?
Well, no. I mean, what I was talking to people about this yesterday actually, and not on a party political basis as such. Where you could say, well, Labour Party voters think this and they believe that, and Conservative voters think that. What there is there definitely is a kind of patterns of worldviews. There is definitely a kind of anti-state, anti-expert,
anti-rational,
movement,
anti-scientific, anti-enlightenment.
Yeah, and so you might see that there are categories like that of people who might have got that view in one sector, may well have it in another, and there are certainly patterns like that. But this is something new. It's got a new worldviews forming which cut across traditional party political boundaries, and but these are kind of new groups, and they will move from topic to topic within those themes.
Well, that's the material for another conference sometime. Thanks very much indeed. For fear of adding to the confusion, I won't attempt to sum up because I might be putting forward my own fake news. And I'm very grateful to all our speakers for having been with us today. And thank you to the audience. And I'd like to give you a round of applause. I hope people will be joining in as well. Thank you very much. Be in touch with you to thank you more formally. And have a pleasant evening, and goodbye to all our listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'll leave.